Now, to news that broke just a few hours ago, no newly convicted transgender person with a history of violence against women will be placed in female prisons in Scotland. The Scottish Prison Service is carrying out what it's called an urgent review of the rules. It comes after Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon was widely criticised following a major row over two trans prisoners. First, Isla Bryson was placed in Cornton Vale. Bryson waiting to be sentenced after being convicted of raping two women before changing gender identity. Bryson, who used to be called Adam Graham and then claimed to be transitioning shortly before the trial. On Thursday, Bryson was moved to a men's prison. It's now emerged a second male prisoner has had their move to a women's prison approved. So Tiffany Scott, used to be known as Andrew Burns, stalked a 13-year-old girl and has since attacked female staff while being held in a men's prison. So, to discuss this situation, I'm now joined by Kate Coleman, who is the director of Keep Prisons Single Sex. Kate, thank you for joining me. So, I want to first ask for your response to this news that there will be a review on the accommodation of transgender prisoners in Scotland.
Well, I think there's two things to be said about this. Firstly, if this is genuine, and if this is not wholly politically motivated, I think it's too little, too late, and it's wholly inadequate. You know, the Scottish Prison Service have been, quote-unquote, undertaking a policy review since 2018, and here we are, 2023, and suddenly it's time for an urgent review. And this temporary measure is still wholly inadequate. At most, it will exclude male prisoners, and I think we need to be quite careful. We're not talking about trying to find out who is genuinely transgender and who's a male faker.
Yes.
We're talking about male prisoners.
Yes.
It is being male that is the risk, and it is being male that counts and needs to see you excluded from the female estate, no questions asked.
But you see, a lot of people have argued that what this really is a in fact, Nicola Sturgeon this week has said it's a cloak for bigotry. People who are worried about the preservation of single-sex prisons, it's just because they hate trans people.
Well, I mean, we're all racist, homophobic, misogynistic,
yeah,
anti-Semitic,
yeah,
probably
whatever.
As well. According to Nancy Kelly, we're anti-Semitic. So, you know, everything is transphobic, everything is bigoted. So
yes.
those words, if they ever had any meaning, that meaning has long since departed.
But everyone understands this basic point, that when it comes to safeguarding, you're not smearing the entire demographic who is subject to checks. You're saying that a minority within that demographic, in this case men, will commit acts of violence against women.
Well, exactly. I mean, you know, and that is the principle of safeguarding. The principle of safeguarding is don't trust people. The principle of safeguarding is ask the questions and don't believe somebody when they say, oh, it's OK, I'm fine, I'm all right. You know, don't exclude. It doesn't matter on what basis you decide to set up special rules to exclude somebody from the normal principles of safeguarding.
Yes.
Don't do that,
so
because that is not safeguarding by definition.
How long has Scotland been doing this? How long have they been housing prisoners according to gender identity, sometimes not even with a GRC, right?
Well, I mean, again, we have to get away from the false notion that having a GRC provides any kind of safeguard, because it doesn't.
Yeah.
But in terms of how long this has been going on for, when we talk about the United Kingdom as a whole, male prisoners have been housed in the female estate since at least the early 1980s. The criteria that a male prisoner has had to fulfil in order to get that transition or that transfer or that initial allocation to the female estate, those have changed over the years. But this is not a new phenomenon by any means. When we look at Scotland in particular, we know that there was a deliberate drive to get this subgroup of male prisoners into the female estate. And James Morton, who was the then director of Scottish Trans Alliance, who actually wrote the current Scottish Prison Service policy on transgender prisoners, it shows up in the metadata, so it's actually quite shocking. She's transgender, so I'm going to use sex-based pronouns. She's quite clear that this was a deliberate push because, you know, if you can get trans women, male prisoners, accepted into a single-sex space in the most challenging of circumstances, then, well, you've set a precedent and you can start rolling it out to other services, you know, because quite clearly, you know, nobody cares about women in prison. You know,
is that part of the problem, that people just don't care enough about prisoners?
I think people don't care enough about prisoners. You know, and I can understand that in a way. I do care about prisoners. But, you know, there's the old maxim, if you can't do the time, then don't do the crime. You know, women in prison are perceived as fallen women, failed women. It's also a very hidden problem. You know, if you look at something like sports, where you've got, what was his name?
Leah
Gavin.
Thomas, maybe?
Leah Thomas, yes, and called Gavin the weightlifter. It's obvious. That's on television. It's obvious. When you're talking about men in prison with women, very often it's hidden. You know, these cases that have hit the press, they're the minority. You know, the prisoners that I know about in the female prison estate, it's hidden. You know, so you can get away almost with. I've noticed that there's kind of like this hypothetical example of, you know, some long since transitioned, fully transitioned trans woman who, you know, the Equal Treatment Bench Book, which is the guide for judges. They refer to such a person as someone who has lived her whole adult life as a wife and mother, you know, who's been charged with some very low-level, non-violent offence, you know, who's willowy and graceful. You know, we've had example of April Ashley, you know, tall, willowy, graceful, beautifully dressed. We're looking at a hypothetical,
right,
and policy and guidance is aimed at protecting this almost platonic ideal, whereas the reality that I know of, which is child abusers, murderers, violent criminals who decide to transition whilst they're in prison, sometimes getting a gender recognition certificate whilst they're in prison,
yes,
retaining their working male genitalia, they're stridently heterosexual, and
so why are we not,
that is the situation that
why are we not having
dealing with
sensible discussions about this? Because, you know,
I think we are now.
Well, we are now, but for a long time the SNP were saying, well, there is just no evidence that men will lie about who they are to commit predatory acts.
Well, I think we need to stop thinking about we need to catch the men out in a lie. It doesn't matter who's lying. You know, maybe Isla really is trans, or maybe Adam is lying. It doesn't matter.
They're still male.
Adam and Isla are still male.
Yes.
And fortunately, we can easily ascertain sex registered at birth,
yes,
which doesn't change. And it's that's the most salient variable to risk, safeguarding, offending, and the management of offenders, no matter what the SNP might like to say.
And of course, women in prison are a particularly vulnerable group. A lot of them have been through domestic violence.
They are a vulnerable group. They are. Most of them end up there because of an association with a violent or criminal man.
Yes.
The majority of them are there for low-level offending. That's not to say at all that you don't get violent women, women who commit sexual assault against children, women who commit murder. Of course you do. But when you look at the offending profiles, again, it is very, very much determined by sex registered at birth. And women, you know, we see these arguments on Twitter and elsewhere. Oh, well, if you don't want a trans woman in the toilets with you, just don't use those toilets. Go somewhere else. I mean, I think those arguments are wholly unacceptable. But women in prison, by definition, obviously, have no choice. Well, if you're in prison and a male pitches up on your house block, tough.
We had today a story in the Daily Record about a former female prisoner who said she had to have a contraceptive coil.
I know Amanda.
Right.
I know Amanda. And that story certainly reflects the other stories that I've been getting from women who are in prison at this very moment in England.
People won't believe it, though. They won't think. I mean, her account, she was talking about being in the shared shower facilities, naked male bodies, aroused, you know, really obviously dangerous situation. No protection for these women. She had the contraceptive coil put in because she felt she had no choice. Constant fear. It's almost like a second punishment on top of the prison.
Well, exactly. Of course it is. It's a second punishment. And you go to imprisonment is the punishment. It's not a place where further torture and punishment occurs, at least not in this country.
But is it that people wouldn't think this was likely? Because, you know, when you think of the case of Karen White, convicted rapist, says that he's female, is moved to a woman's prison and goes on to assault female inmates. People think, but that can't be happening, can it?
Well, it's still happening now.
Right.
It's still happening now. There was a male prisoner who got a gender recognition certificate, having been sentenced to a lengthy sentence for murder. He murdered a man, but so what? He's 6'2", he's still got his full appendages, and he sexually assaults or has coerced consensual sex. And you shouldn't be having consensual sex in prison, right? With vulnerable female offenders. He then gets moved on to the next prison and then moved on to the next prison. So for years now, he's basically been having a jolly old time of it at the expense of women in prison, hopping round the female estate. And the policies don't just permit this, they facilitate it. They actively facilitate it.
How did we reach this point? You know, we've had a Conservative government for the last 12 years, and this has all happened and continued to happen under their watch. So it looks as though whoever you vote for, left or right, this is going to carry on. How did this kind of ideology, with these terrible ramifications, end up being so implemented and no one did anything about it?
Because it was the decades of quiet, careful, behind-the-scenes conversations without making any fuss, without drawing any attention, just to start getting everything in place. So now when you start peeling back the layers, you see, oh, well, this practice is bad. OK, what's behind that? Oh, the policy's bad. What's behind that? Oh, my God, the previous policy was bad. What's behind that? Oh, my God, it's legislation. You keep peeling back the layers and you see just how deep this goes.
And is it because of interest groups such as Stonewall,
absolutely,
who have said...
Yes, Stonewall and, the predecessors of Stonewall, Press for Change, Beaumont Society, going back to the 1970s and 1980s.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And your feeling with Scotland is that this is a kind of smokescreen, that really the SNP would like to continue with this ideological position?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they are totally committed to this ideology. Why that is a separate question, but they are completely committed to this ideology. You only had to witness the passing of the Gender Recognition Reform Bill through stages 1 to 3, and the stage 3 debates in Holyrood. I attended those, and it was chilling what I considered to be an abuse of parliamentary process. Quite apart from the wholly egregious content, just the structure of what was happening was absolutely chilling, and a lesson in how not to do democracy. So I don't believe for 1 second that this is either genuine or lasting. And I think if it were, well, where's all the opposition? Where is Maggie Chapman? Where's Patrick Harvey? Where's Lorna Slater? Where's Scottish Trans Alliance? Where are all of these lobby groups, these interest groups, and the most vocal of MSPs? Why are they not screaming and shouting, and vulnerable trans women and all of this? They're silent, and I think they're silent for a very good reason, because they know that this isn't real.
Kate, we don't have much time, but I want to ask you before we finish, is given the egregious nature of this particular Bryson case, and we've all now seen this, this case of a double rapist who was not just going to be moved to a women's prison, was being housed in a women's prison already.
He was there.
Do you think that because of this in the public outcry, things might now actually change?
I think they have to, and I think we have to be very careful to just keep this current, because what concerns me is that people will think that Andrew Burns and Adam Graham... I mean, Andrew Burns is one of the most terrifyingly violent prisoners who I have ever read about. And when I read that he was being transferred, my blood ran cold. I can't think of a less appropriate transfer. Is that people will view these as the exception. They're not the exception. They are absolutely normal for this population in female prisons.
Right, well, I do hope something can be done about this. And Kate, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this. Really appreciate it.